the clock. I ought to know by now. I ought to know by now. Break your trust. You ought to know by now. You getting all my love. You ought to know by now. You get what you see. You ought to know by now to have faith in me.